Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. This time, we're going to be taking a look at discrimination in the workplace in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah.
This is a tricky subject. So, luckily, we have an expert here to help us kind of navigate all this stuff. We're going to be looking at some resources today from a Vietnamese law firm called Tran.
Okay.
And they specialize in this area of law and even have a couple of case studies on their website that I thought were really interesting to kind of illustrate some of these points. So,
Great.
yeah, so maybe we can just jump right into it. What does the law actually say about discrimination in the workplace in Vietnam?
Well, the 2019 Labor Code in Vietnam makes it really clear that discrimination in the workplace is against the law. And their definition of discrimination is really broad. It's not just like the obvious stuff like gender or race or anything like that. It covers things like marital status or pregnancy, religion, union membership, even political views and HIV status.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
So, like, it's not just, firing someone because they're a certain race or something like that.
Yeah.
What are some more subtle ways that discrimination can kind of manifest?
So one thing that I think people often misunderstand about discrimination is that it doesn't actually have to be intentional for it to be against the law.
Yeah.
So the effects of a decision matter just as much as like the intent. So let's say that there's like a company policy that seems really neutral on the surface, but then it ends up impacting certain groups more negatively, like women or people with disabilities or something.
Yeah.
That could still be considered discrimination, even if the company didn't like explicitly set out to target those groups.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of people would say, well, my intentions were good, so it doesn't really matter what the outcome was. But it sounds like that's not how the law looks at it.
Right. The law really focuses on the effects of the action. So you have to be careful about that.
Okay, well, so getting into those specific effects, then, let's take a look at one of these case studies that Lee and Tran have on their website. The first one is about a pregnant woman who was denied a training opportunity by her company. And they basically said, well, you're about to go on maternity leave soon, so it doesn't really make sense to invest in training you right now. And I can see both sides of this. Like, from the company's perspective, they might say, well, we're trying to be practical here. We don't want to waste resources on someone who's not going to be here. But then on the other hand, denying someone an opportunity just because they're pregnant and you assume that they're not going to be available, it just seems wrong.
Yeah.
So how do we decide what's actually discrimination here?
Well, that's a really interesting case. And it shows kind of that tension between like business decisions
Yeah.
and what the law actually considers discrimination.
Mm-hmm.
So in Vietnam, to figure out whether something is discrimination, there are 3 criteria that need to be met.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one then.
Yeah. So the first thing that you have to show is that there was less favorable treatment. So that means someone who is claiming discrimination has to show that they were treated worse than someone else in a similar situation.
But, like, how do you compare when pregnancy is involved? Because you can't really compare a pregnant woman to a man who's in the same position,
Yeah, it's really tricky when pregnancy is a factor. The law basically focuses on whether the pregnant employee was put at a disadvantage compared to her colleagues. So like in this case, we'd have to look at whether denying the training opportunity would actually hurt this woman's career. So was she denied an opportunity for advancement or for like skill development that her colleagues who weren't pregnant did receive?
So even though there's no, like, direct male comparison here, denying her this training could still be considered less favorable treatment just because of the impact it has on her specifically.
Right, exactly. It's about looking at it from her perspective and whether the actions of the company put her at a disadvantage just because she's pregnant and about to go on maternity leave.
Okay, so that's one factor down. What's the second thing that needs to be proven in these discrimination cases?
So the second factor is that this less favorable treatment that we just talked about has to be because of a protected characteristic.
Yeah.
So in this case, that would be because the woman is pregnant.
Okay.
And this is where it can be tricky because you have to show that the employer's decision was based at least in part on the fact that she was pregnant, not on something else.
So in this case, how could she demonstrate that the decision to deny her the training was specifically because she was pregnant?
Well, she would need to show some kind of evidence that her pregnancy was a factor. Like, was
Yeah.
there anything in writing from the company explicitly stating that her pregnancy was the reason why they weren't giving her the training? Or did other employees who had similar experience and qualifications but who weren't pregnant receive the training?
So it's really important to keep track of all this documentation, like emails, performance reviews, internal memos, anything that kind of shows the company's thought process there.
Exactly. You need to have those receipts.
Okay, so we've got these first two factors, less favorable treatment and showing that it was linked to the protected characteristic. But you mentioned there were three. So what's that third one all about?
So the third factor is that the less favorable treatment can't be based on something that's like a genuine job requirement.
Yeah, okay.
So employers are allowed to treat people differently if it's based on something that's a bona fide essential job requirement.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But the thing is that these requirements have to be legitimate and directly related to the job.
Right.
It can't just be some kind of flimsy excuse.
So going back to our case study then, could this employer argue that denying the pregnant woman the training was based on legitimate job requirements? Like, what if the training was something she needed to do her job effectively during the time that she would be on leave?
It's possible, but they would need to have really good evidence to support that claim. Like, could they prove that the specific skills taught in the training were absolutely essential for her to do her job effectively while she was gone? Or could they show that delaying the training would actually really hurt the company in some way?
So they can't just say it. They have to show it.
Exactly. They need to have concrete evidence.
Okay, so that's a pretty high bar then
It is.
for them to...
Yeah, if they can't provide that evidence, then it's likely that their decision is going to be seen as discriminatory.
This is already so interesting, and we've only gone through one case study.
I know, right?
And there's another one to get to. But before we do that, I want to ask you about this burden of proof idea. Because in a lot of legal situations, it's up to the person who's claiming something happened to prove it right. Like, they're the ones who have to come forward with all the evidence. So in these cases, is it the employee's responsibility to prove that they were discriminated against? Or is it the company's responsibility to prove that they didn't discriminate?
That's such a great question, and it's one of the things that surprises people a lot about the way this works in Vietnam. In these cases, the burden of proof is on the employer.
Really?
Yeah.
So it's up to them to demonstrate that they didn't do anything wrong.
Exactly.
Wow, okay, that really changes things.
It means that employers need to be really careful, and they have to make sure that they have really good documentation to support all their decisions, especially the ones that could be seen as discriminatory.
So going back to our case study about the pregnant woman,
Right.
the company would need to be able to show that their decision about the training wasn't based on her pregnancy at all, but on
Exactly.
something else.
They might need to have documentation that shows what skills were taught in the training and why those specific skills were important for the employee to have right away.
Mm.
Or maybe they could show that they explored other options, like delaying the training until after she got back from maternity leave.
So it's not just enough to not do something discriminatory. You have to be able to prove that you didn't do it.
Right. It's about creating a clear paper trail that shows that the decision-making process was fair and objective.
Okay, that's super interesting. So let's move on then to the second case study from Tran. This one's all about a woman who was applying for a promotion within her company. And during the interview, they asked her about her childcare arrangements, and they also asked about her husband's job because it happens to be in a different city.
Interesting.
And then the company decided to just cancel the promotion altogether. Nobody got it. But later on, it came out that they had already decided they weren't going to promote her. But they did it because of assumptions about her family life.
Wow.
They were worried that she wouldn't be able to handle the new job with her family. And they thought that because her husband's job was in a different city, that maybe she would end up moving.
That's tough.
Yeah. So on the surface, it looks like they were trying to be fair by canceling the promotion for everyone.
Right?
But the fact that they had already decided against her based on all these assumptions is a pretty big red flag for me.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is a good example of how discrimination can be really subtle.
Yeah.
On the surface, everything seems fine,
Right.
but then underneath, there are all these biases that are affecting things.
Yeah. So this isn't a case of like explicitly saying, we're not promoting you because you're a woman with a family. It's
Yeah.
more about...
It's about putting obstacles in her way because of these ideas about how women are supposed to balance their work and their family life.
Yeah, this just seems like a classic case of unconscious bias to me. Like maybe the people making this decision didn't even realize that their assumptions were influencing their judgment.
You're probably right. A lot of times these biases are unconscious, and that makes them even harder to deal with.
So how would we apply those same three criteria for proving discrimination to a case like this one? Let's start with that less favorable treatment idea again.
Okay, so even though in the end nobody got the promotion, this woman was treated differently during the interview process. Asking her about her childcare and her husband's job while other candidates weren't shows that she was judged by a different standard.
It's almost like those questions were designed to make her look bad, even
Mhm.
though they were disguised as just casual conversation.
Right. They were trying to figure out how committed she would be to the role, but they were basing that on assumptions about her family.
So that's the less favorable treatment, but how do we connect that to her gender?
This is where gathering evidence is really, really important. To show that this treatment was because she was a woman, she would need to show that this is a pattern of behavior at the company. Like, have other women been asked similar questions during interviews? Are there any company policies or even just informal practices that suggest that women, and especially women with families, are less likely to get promoted?
So once again, it's all about that documentation.
Exactly. Anything that shows a systemic bias or pattern of behavior can help prove that this less favorable treatment was because of her gender.
Okay, so we have the less favorable treatment, and we have the link to her being a woman. But what about that third criteria, the job requirements? Could the company argue that these questions about her childcare and her husband's job were actually related to the job itself?
This is where the company would really have to make a strong case. Like, could they prove that those questions were essential for deciding if she could do the job? Was the position going to require lots of travel or unusual work hours that might clash with her family life?
Yeah, I guess that would make sense.
But if not, then it's pretty hard to justify those questions as being related to the job.
It's like they're prying into her personal life based on these assumptions they have about her.
Exactly. And don't forget, the burden of proof is on the employer.
Hmm.
They have to show that their actions were justified and not discriminatory.
So in this case, they would need really strong evidence to show that those questions were actually job-related.
Exactly.
This is a really fascinating case study because it shows how sneaky discrimination can be. It's not always about people saying mean things or being aggressive.
Right.
It's about these assumptions and biases that we all have that affect how we see and judge other people.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for both employees and employers to be aware of these subtle forms of discrimination and to know what the law said about it.
Okay, so we've gone over these two very different case studies, and clearly this whole issue is really complex, but I'm curious what happens when an employer actually is found guilty of discrimination in Vietnam. Are there penalties for that?
Yes, definitely. The labor code in Vietnam lays out specific administrative sanctions that can be given to employers who are found guilty of discrimination.
So what does that mean? Like, what kind of consequences are we talking about here?
Well, most of the penalties are financial like fines, and they can be pretty hefty. For example, if a company is found to have discriminated against someone during the hiring process, or in how they manage their employees based on gender or race or some other protected characteristic, they could be fined between 10 and 20 million Vietnamese dong.
Wow. Okay, so they're not messing around then.
No, they're not.
Are there different fines for different types of discrimination, or is it pretty much a standard fine across the board?
The fines actually vary based on the situation. So, for example, discriminating against someone based on their salary also comes with a fine of 10 to 20 million dong. But let's say that an employer took action against someone because they were involved in union activities, which is a protected right in Vietnam.
Right.
That fine would be a lot bigger. It would be between 30 and 60 million dong.
Wow, that's a big jump.
Yeah, and it shows how important it is in Vietnam to protect workers' rights,
Right.
to organize and to advocate for themselves.
Okay, well, we've covered so much ground today. We've talked about how discrimination is defined in Vietnam, the criteria for proving it, and even the penalties for breaking the law. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to add about this whole issue of employment discrimination in Vietnam?
I think it's important to remember that even though Vietnam has made a lot of progress in protecting people from discrimination, it takes a long time to really change attitudes and biases in society.
That's true.
So laws are important, but they're only part of the solution.
It's like those unconscious biases we were talking about.
Exactly. They can be so ingrained and difficult to get rid of.
So what else can we do then? If laws aren't enough, what needs to happen to really make things better?
Well, I think to create a truly inclusive and equitable society, everyone needs to be involved. Individuals, organizations, and society as a whole. We need to be willing to talk about these issues, to recognize our own biases, and to stand up for what's right.
Yeah, it's about having these conversations.
Exactly.
And being willing to call things out when we see them.
Right. The more we understand about discrimination, the better we can fight against it.
Well, I'm really glad we had this conversation today. It's been incredibly eye-opening for me, and I really appreciate you coming on the show to share your expertise with us.
My pleasure. I hope this helps our listeners understand their rights and advocate for themselves.
Now, before we sign off, I want to leave everyone with something to think about. Given everything we've learned today, what steps can you take to promote fairness and equality in your own workplace? It doesn't matter if you're an employee or a manager. We all have the power to make a difference. So what can you do to be a part of the solution?
I love that question. It really starts with being aware of our own biases, speaking up when we see something that's not right, and advocating for policies that promote fairness.
It's about taking action no matter how small,
Exactly.
because even small actions can make a big difference.
They can.
Well, thank you again for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep diving deep.